Sometimes the words we don't expect, the ones spoken in passing when no one is looking, are the very words that stay with us for years. I never thought my ex's friend would be the one to say something that etched itself so deeply into my memory. What began as a casual exchange turned into an unforgettable moment of understanding and connection that reshaped how I saw myself and even how I saw love. If you're curious how it happened, stay with me. And before I start, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Which city do you call home? My name is Deborah, and I'm 70 years old now. I've lived through my share of chapters, some filled with joy, others with regret, and many with ordinary days that blended into one another. But tonight, I want to tell you about a time that wasn't ordinary at all. It was a time when words, just words, stirred something in me that I didn't know still existed. It happened years after my divorce. By then, I was comfortable with solitude. My days followed the same rhythm. Mornings with my coffee at the kitchen table by the window, afternoons tending to the little flower beds in the yard, evenings watching old shows I'd seen a dozen times before. My ex-husband and I had parted ways without much drama, just the kind of weariness that comes when two people realize they've stopped listening to each other. We didn't keep in touch, though he still lived in the same town. That night I'm about to share with you began quietly, as most evenings did. I was in the kitchen making tea when the phone rang. It was Raymond, an old friend of my ex's. To say I was surprised would be putting it lightly. He and I had never been particularly close. He was one of those men you noticed in the background. Polite, reserved, never overstepping. He had been a part of my ex's circle, not mine. His voice carried a certain weight that night, a warmth I wasn't expecting. "Deborah," he said, "I hope I'm not calling too late." "No," I answered, curious. "I was just making tea. What's on your mind?" There was a pause, the kind of silence that isn't awkward but deliberate, as if he was choosing his words carefully. Then he said something that startled me. "I was thinking about you today, about how strong you always seemed, even when things weren't easy. I just wanted you to know that." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. My first instinct was to brush it off, to say something casual like, "Oh, that was a long time ago." But instead, I felt myself growing still. No one had spoken to me like that in years. Not in a way that acknowledged not just my existence, but my strength. I sank into the chair at the kitchen table, the steam from the tea curling upward. "That's kind of you, Raymond," I said softly. "I don't think anyone's ever told me that before. Not like that." He laughed gently, a low and almost reluctant sound. "Well, maybe they should have. I always thought it. I just never said it." There was something so disarming in his honesty. The kitchen around me seemed to fade, the hum of the refrigerator receding into the background. It felt as though his words reached across the years and the silence and found me exactly where I was, still trying, still standing, still carrying things I rarely spoke about. We talked longer than I expected. He asked me about my garden, about the books I'd been reading, about the old house I still lived in. There was no rush in his voice, no hidden agenda, just an attentiveness that felt rare. The longer we spoke, the more I realized how starved I had been for conversation that wasn't about errands or appointments or the weather. And yet, underneath it all, there was a subtle tension. I knew he had been my ex-husband's friend. That fact hung between us, unspoken but present. Still, the way he spoke to me, without pity, without pretense, was different from anything I had known in years. At one point, I remember glancing at the clock and realizing more than an hour had passed. My tea had long gone cold. "Raymond," I said, "why now? Why call me tonight?" He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, because I kept thinking of that day after the divorce. You were walking out of the courthouse, holding your head high, and I thought, there goes a woman who knows her own worth, even if no one else sees it. That picture never left me. I guess I just wanted you to know someone noticed. The words went straight through me. For years, I had carried the memory of that day like a scar, shame, relief, and exhaustion all tangled together. To know that someone else had seen strength instead of weakness, it changed the way I remembered it. I leaned back, blinking against the sudden sting of tears. You don't know what that means to me, I whispered. Maybe I do, he said softly. Sometimes words stay with us longer than we realize. When I hung up the phone that night, the house felt different. Not less empty, but somehow warmer, as though a light had been switched on in a room I had forgotten existed. I walked through the hallway, brushing my hand against the familiar pictures on the wall, and realized I was smiling. It wasn't romance. Not yet. It wasn't even longing. It was something quieter, something deeper, the reminder that even at 70, even after love had left and years had passed, there were still words that could move me, words that could stay. And Raymond's words that night did. I didn't sleep much after that call. It wasn't because I was troubled. It was because the quiet of the house had changed shape, and I kept listening to it, like you do after you move a piece of furniture and the room suddenly has different echoes. I left the cup with its ring of cold tea on the kitchen table and stood by the window a long time, watching the street lamp make a pale path across the sidewalk. Every so often a car passed, slow, respectful, as if it didn't want to disturb the hour. I felt oddly awake, the way you do when a kind word opens a window you forgot you'd painted shut. The next morning I went out to my garden early, before the sun got firm. I pinched the spent blooms from the petunias and tied the floppy heads of the tomatoes to their stakes. There's something about the small, precise work of tending to living things that puts your thoughts in the right order. I kept hearing Raymond's voice, steady, unhurried, the voice of a man who doesn't sell his attention for cheap. I noticed, he had said. Isn't it strange how noticing can feel like a gift all on its own? Around noon, I found a note tucked under the front doormat, held down by a flat gray pebble. His handwriting was straight-backed and careful, the kind of script you don't see much anymore. I read it twice on the porch before I went inside. Deborah, if you're free this afternoon, I'd like to buy you coffee. There's that diner on Cedar with the red booths. No hurry, no expectation, just conversation. If you'd rather not, please know the invitation carries no weight but respect. I stood there with the paper in my hand and felt a small, warming lift inside me. Coffee. Conversation. No hurry. Respect. Good words. All of them. I washed my hands, changed my blouse, and on a whim that surprised even me, chose a soft blue scarf that used to make me feel elegant on ordinary days. I tucked the note into my purse like a keepsake. The bell over the diner door gave that friendly, hollow ring that belongs to 100 small towns. The booths were as red as he'd said, the kind of red that announces itself with cheer and refuses to apologize. Raymond was already there, a tall glass of water sweating onto a paper coaster. He stood when he saw me. That small courtesy, standing up, sent a respectful hush through the moment, as if the afternoon itself had decided to behave. Deborah, he said, and my name sounded new in his voice. Raymond, I answered, sliding into the booth. You picked a good place. I figured the pie would do some of the talking if we ran out of things to say. We'll see about that, I said, smiling. We did not run out of things to say. The waitress poured coffee and called us Han, and we talked the way people do when there's no competition in it. He asked about my roses, and I told him how the yellow ones always seem to get their way, how they muscle out the pinks unless you stake your ground. He told me his knees complained on rainy days, and I told him about the small victory of replacing my own porch light fixture without calling anyone's son for help. When he laughed, his eyes narrowed at the corners in a way that looked like an old photograph of generosity. We did not talk about my ex, not at first. The ghost of that topic sat at the far end of the booth, polite enough not to interrupt, but present like a coat someone forgot to take home. At one point, Raymond touched the rim of his cup with a knuckle and said, almost to the coffee, "I'm aware I'm an untidy part of your past by association." "That's not how I'd put it," I said. "You were part of someone else's circle, that's all. Circles change." He lifted his eyes to mine and nodded as if that was something worth filing away. "If we keep talking," he said, "I want to be sure we're not stepping on old promises. Even if they were broken, I respect the place where they once stood." I took a breath and felt the carefulness of it. "I appreciate that," I said. "I want that too. Carefulness, I mean." We let that agreement settle between us like a new tablecloth. Then he asked if I'd ever been to the community center's book sale. I told him I had not, though I'd meant to. So we paid for the coffee and stepped out into a day that had grown softly warm, the heat not oppressive but persuasive. The book sale was only a few blocks away. Walking there, I noticed how he slowed at each crosswalk in a way that allowed me to choose the pace. He didn't gesture grandly or insist on carrying my purse. He simply matched me. I have learned to recognize the small manners that save a woman miles of explanation. Inside the community center, long tables bowed under the weight of other people's pages. The air was sweet with dust and the faint after-scent of gymnasium varnish. I stood at a table of paperbacks with cracking spines and felt the comfort of so many stories trying to keep their posture. I picked up a gardening guide from the 70s, full of cheery diagrams and women in headscarves smiling at squashes as if they'd told a joke. "This looks like you," he said, indicating the headscarf with a tilt of his head. "Oh, I know her," I said. "She and I have argued about slugs." "And who won?" "We're still counting votes." He chuckled, and his hand hovered above the table for a moment, as if he'd remembered he had something to show me, and then thought better of it. I found an old collection of poems and flipped to one at random. "Listen," I said, and I read a few lines out loud, a stanza about late afternoon light on a kitchen floor and the mercy of ordinary chores. When I finished, he stood very still, the loud room dimming around us. "That's you," he said. "You make the ordinary look like it's been waiting all day to be loved." I put the book down softly. It was not the kind of compliment you fling at someone to see if it will stick. It was the kind you hand over with both palms, knowing it might be kept. I felt a slow, grateful ache settle in my chest, and for a beat I didn't know what to do with my face. I think I looked like a person who's just been told the sky is blue in a tone that made her hear the news for the first time. We left the center with 2 paper bags of old words between us. Outside, the sky had begun to gather itself in a way that always makes me check the edges of clouds. The forecast must have guessed wrong because a breeze came up from nowhere, and leaves turned their pale undersides to the air like a crowd showing their palms. "Storm," I said, and he nodded. "I'll walk you home," he said. "And if the power flickers, I have lanterns." "What a thing to carry around," I said. You'd be surprised what a man carries when he likes to be prepared to keep a conversation going. We made it to my front step just as the first drops tossed their shoulders at the pavement. On impulse, so unlike the methodical person I generally am, I asked if he'd come in. "If you don't mind the unpredictability of my circuit breakers," I added. "I'll take that risk," he said. The house accepted him without fuss. Some homes are stubborn about visitors. Mine has always been hospitable, the way old furniture learns to bend without complaint. I set the bags of books on the hall table and led him to the kitchen. The storm negotiated with the roof. The smell of rain moved through the screens. We found ourselves talking about the courthouse day he'd mentioned, the one where my past and future had looked at each other across a scuffed floor. "I've replayed it more times than I should," he admitted. "I suppose that's foolish." "I don't think it's foolish to remember clearly," I said. "What would be the use of living through something if we can't learn the shape of it afterward?" He leaned on the doorframe and studied me with a softness that didn't make me flinch. "You didn't look broken," he said. "You looked intact. Not untouched, but intact." I didn't have a word for it then. I didn't either, I confessed. I thought if I kept my chin level, the rest of me might not fall apart. "Sometimes the chin knows what the heart can't say yet," he said. The kitchen light blinked, made up its mind, and went out. The storm congratulated itself. In the dimming, the world grew quiet and close. He reached into his bag and, true to his word, produced a small lantern with a steady domestic glow, no drama to it at all. I set it on the table, and the whole room seemed to lean toward its patience. "Do you mind if I light a candle?" I asked. "Please," he said. "I like the way candlelight tells the truth about rooms." "What truth is that?" "That they were made for people to talk in." We sat across from each other, hands folded or restless, adjusting to the calibrations shadow makes. I could hear the rain find the gutters, the polite shush of it. He told me he had married once, and that the ending had been quiet, not a fire, but an ember fading out of mutual neglect. I wasn't as good a listener then, he said. I learned too late that paying attention is not a talent, it's a practice. I wish more people believed that, I said. It would save the world a lot of misunderstandings. We fell into a kind of silence that wasn't empty but full of shared air. I felt my shoulders drop, felt the way laughter had already made room for itself between us without needing a punchline. He was a gentleman of careful distances, which made the small distances he closed feel earned. I could have sat there all night, doing nothing but letting our sentences arrive when they were ready. He glanced at the candle. "Deborah," he said, "I'm going to say something I've wanted to say since before I knew I had a right to think it." I lifted a hand, not to stop him, but to straighten the moment as if it were a picture tilted on the wall. "Go on." "You deserved a witness," he said. "Back then. Not a judge, not a rescuer, not a commentator, just a witness. Someone to stand to the side and say, 'I see you. You are doing a hard thing with dignity.' I didn't do it then, but I can do it now. If you'll let me, I want to be the kind of man who doesn't look away when your courage shows up in everyday clothes." I felt the heat of the candle on my cheek. The rain applauded softly. I could have made a joke, could have dodged the fullness with a quip about everyday clothes. But there are some doors you don't laugh through. You step through them with your eyes open. "Thank you," I said. "That's a clean kind of promise." He nodded, and a small, relieved breath left him, as if the room had been holding its lungs tight and could finally exhale. "May I ask you something else?" he said. "And if it's too forward, tell me and I'll remember to walk backward." "That's quite a dance," I said. "Ask." "May I hold your hand?" he asked. For a moment. Not to rush anything, not to claim anything. Just to say I'm here in a way skin can understand. My life has taught me that consent is not just a word, it's a posture. It's a woman choosing where she puts her body and how she names the touch that's welcome. I looked at his hand, quiet on the table, palm easy, not reaching across the distance without invitation. "Yes," I said, "you may." He didn't take it like you take a thing. He received it like you receive communion. His hand was warm and dry, his palm a practical map. We sat that way for a minute that felt long without feeling heavy. The lantern hummed its little electrical hymn. The candle gave us both the color of forgiveness. "I want to say something you might remember later," he said, voice low. "Not because I like to hear myself talk, but because words have been good to us today." "All right." "You were not the afterthought in anyone's life," he said. "Not a footnote to a man's chapter, not a postscript to your own. You are the page people turn to when they've had enough of noise and want to read something true." I did not cry. I am not ashamed to tell you that I held fast to my dignity and still felt my heart open like a window that had been stuck for a season too long. I pressed my thumb into the soft crosshatch of his knuckles and nodded, not trusting my voice to carry the whole gratitude without spilling. The power returned with the cautious click of a house remembering its habits. We did not drop each other's hands at once. Some endings don't need to be abrupt to be clear. When we let go, it felt like a door being closed gently, with the knowledge that it would be opened again. "Would you like to stay for a simple supper?" I asked. "I have tomatoes that need eating and bread that wants to be toasted." "That sounds like a feast," he said. We moved around the kitchen with the ordinary choreography of people who haven't rehearsed but know the steps anyway. He sliced the tomatoes with an attention that made each round perfect. I buttered the bread and set the table, aware of how good it felt to do old tasks with new company. We ate quietly, admiring the way salt can be a kind of prayer when sprinkled with care. We talked about nothing consequential and everything essential. The sound of baseball on a distant radio, the satisfaction of a clean porch, the piece of a grocery list written in a friendly hand. After we cleaned the plates and left them to dry like hard-working soldiers at rest, we stood at the doorway and watched the sky forget the storm. The street was wet and reflective, making doubles of everything: trees, mailboxes, the neighbor's dog trotting with important purpose. The air smelled like a new promise. "There will be talk," I said finally. "I don't mean I fuss about gossip. I mean that in small towns, kindness itself sometimes gets discussed like it's mischief." "There may be," he said. "But we'll give them nothing to feed on but good behavior." "That suits me," I said. He turned toward me, not closing the distance until I nodded. He didn't kiss me. It wasn't that kind of night. He rested his forehead against mine for the space of a breath, a greeting made of shared air, and I felt the steady percussion of a heart that wasn't mine keeping time with a heart that was. "Thank you for trusting me with your afternoon," he said. "Thank you for trusting me with your words," I replied. When he left, the porch light threw a warm coin of gold onto the steps. He paused at the gate and looked back, and I lifted my hand. A small moment, but it contained the day the way a ring holds a story you can spin but not untell. In the days that followed, we practiced the slow art of attention. We didn't take big, dramatic leaps. We took the kind of steps you can take in good shoes. He came by with fresh peaches, and I sent him home with a jar of jam that wasn't quite set right, but tasted like August anyway. We walked to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings and let the musicians' soft fiddles fill in the parts of our talk that didn't need words. Every time he asked before he reached for my hand, and every time I found I liked the asking as much as the touch. You might think it would get old, the asking, but it never did. It felt like good manners knocking on the door of something tender and being welcomed in. One afternoon, we ran into my ex-husband outside the hardware store. The three of us stood there in the plain sunlight, nothing dramatic about it, no violins, just the clink of a cartwheel and the quiet hustle of a town doing its errands. Raymond didn't step forward like a challenger. He didn't step back like a coward. He stood where he was and let me choose the tone. "Hello," I said to the man I had once promised to love until the future told us both another story. "How are you?" He said he was fine. He glanced at Raymond, recognized him, and looked as if he wanted to dust off a script that no longer fit. I was the one who ended it. I was the one who had the right to introduce, or not. "This is Raymond," I said, "an old acquaintance. We've been catching up." My ex nodded, and a thing passed over his face that might have been relief or regret. I'm not in the business of diagnosing other people's expressions anymore. He made a polite remark about the weather, and I echoed it. And then we all said the kind of goodbyes adults say when they'd prefer not to embarrass one another. When he was gone, Raymond didn't reach for me. He didn't comment or seek a trophy for his restraint. He merely waited until we had crossed the street and said, with simple admiration, "You handled that like a person who knows the difference between gentleness and permission." "What do you mean?" I asked. "You were gentle with him," he said, "but you didn't give him permission to name you. You named yourself." It was like someone had polished the glass in a window I'd been looking through for years. Another phrase to keep. Another sentence to live up to. On the first evening that felt like fall, I invited him over to sit on the porch and listen to the crickets confide in the trees. I wore the blue scarf again because I'd begun to like the way it felt like a small flag of intention. He brought a tin of butter cookies the size of a good joke. We ate a few and let the crumbs testify on the plate. The street settled into its nighttime softness. A radio from a block away found an old song and offered it to anyone willing to listen. He cleared his throat gently. "I've been thinking about promises," he said, "about the ones we make and the ones we keep by how we show up." I had been thinking about them too. "Go on," I said. "I can't promise perfection," he said. "I'm old enough to know better. I can promise steadiness. I can promise that if I ever forget to listen, I'll learn again quickly. And I can promise that your courage will not have to shout to be heard." I looked at his hands resting on his knees, at the life they'd already held, at the life they could still hold. "I can promise something back," I said. "I can promise I won't pretend to need rescuing when what I need is respect. I can promise to tell the truth, even if it's late. And I can promise that I'll keep the porch light on, first for myself, and if you'd like it, for you too." He smiled then, not with triumph or relief, but with that quiet kind of gladness that makes people look younger without looking foolish. We didn't seal it with anything dramatic. We let the night, and the crickets and the faint trumpet down the block do the sealing for us. If you're still with me, if you've listened all the way to this point, you might be wondering whether we fell in love, whether there were grand gestures or declarations in the rain. Life at 70 tends not to favor grand gestures unless they're necessary, which they usually aren't. What we have, is a room with a window open, and 2 chairs pulled up to the same table. It's a habit of words that don't waste themselves. It's attention practiced until it looks like ease. And yes, there are certain sentences I keep in the pocket of my heart for days when the world feels too loud or too empty. You make the ordinary look like it's been waiting all day to be loved. You are not the afterthought. You named yourself. They are not poetry printed in a book. They are a man's voice across a diner table, across a dark kitchen, across a porch where the night knows your name and pronounces it gently. When I go to sleep now, the house has its familiar quiet again, but it's a quiet full of company. I turn off the lamp, fold the corner of my page, and feel my life making room for itself the way a good chair learns your shape over time. I think of the hand I said yes to, the lantern that hummed patiently while the storm ran out of stories, the way a respectful question can be the most beautiful doorbell. And if, now and then, I feel old fears try to re-enter without knocking, I remember the simplest, bravest promise Raymond made, to be a witness. I say it out loud, sometimes, just 2 words, just enough. I witness. Perhaps that's why his words stayed in my memory, and not because they were polished or rare, but because they were placed exactly where they were needed, and then tended like a garden. You don't forget the sentences that teach you how to stand up straighter in your own life. You don't forget the voice that says, kindly and without hurry, that you are the page people turn to when they want the truth. So when the morning comes and I draw back the curtain, and the day arrives with its honest list, coffee, laundry, tomatoes, call the pharmacy. I say good morning to it, and it says good morning back. Somewhere out there, a man I once knew only as my ex-husband's friend is tying his shoes, picking up his keys, and choosing his words with the same care he chooses a lantern on a day the sky looks undecided. And I am here, on a porch that knows my step, ready to listen, ready to speak, and ready, at last, to be remembered by the life I'm living.